So first of all, just to say, yeah, big welcome and thank you for being here. My name's Max and I'm the director of a project called the Visionaries, which is a decentralized school and community for visionaries. So it's for individuals who are curious about how nature connection and education can support us to live more healthily and in connection with one another and with the earth. And we run a lot of projects and build community around connecting with nature in healthy ways and evolving our education systems to be more nature connected. We help schools to be more visionary in their thinking and doing and in their cultures. In practice, that looks like running lots of trainings and facilitation trainings for young nature connected facilitators. And consultancy with schools. You can check out more of us online. I wanted to start just a little bit to connect. Today we're really here to explore our relationship to land and all that we inherit through that. And so I just want to start with a little acknowledgement and gratitude for the land. So just going to invite you to connect with the land that you are sitting on. And you can have your eyes open or closed for this, just to connect with your body and the physical contact, the undeniable contact of your body on the earth where it exists in this present moment, and the undeniability of that. Take a moment to connect with all of the beings, the humans and the non-humans that this land that you're standing on also supports, that it supports now, that it has supported in the past and will support for eons to come. Take a moment to acknowledge how much history this land holds that you're on, the untold histories and the told. To acknowledge the harms and the injustices that have happened where you are standing or sitting, between groups of humans and also between humans and the natural world, such as through colonization, appropriation of land and people, privatization of land. But also be grateful that we all have an undeniable gift and right to be parts of the greater earth community, and that we can take action against our alienation and separation from the land towards greater healing and justice. So today we're going to be exploring, thanks to wonderful conversation with Dalia, who I met through as she came to the village at the edge of the world, which is a retreat that we run up in the Lake District every summer for 14 to 30-year-olds. And with Miriam, who is on a wonderful and very interesting journey with the Hardwick Estate, which I'll leave you to share more about that. But I want to say just that we're exploring sensitive topics today, and I'm really inviting in curiosity and openness and mutual vulnerability. It's, with things like ownership and the histories that we've inherited, it's really important that we bring curiosity and empathy to these situations, both within ourselves and between ourselves. So to invite you to move beyond blaming and shaming, and just to remember that we don't choose the womb that we're born from, nor the social context that we inherit, but what we do with what we inherit is really significant. I'm going to invite you to, as you've already been doing, participate in the chat function. The ways it's going to work is I'm going to hand over very briefly to Miriam and Dalia, and then they'll have a discussion for most of the session, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end, and then I'll just do a bit of a closing. So just by way of quick intro, maybe you could have 2 minutes each from yourself, Dalia and Miriam, on quick introduction.
Nice. I think I'll go first just so that I can jump off of what Max mentioned about the village. Max and I, we met at the village at the end of the world, or edge of the world, it was August last year. And yeah, it was one of the most life-changing experiences, without sounding too cheesy or cliche, but it really was very powerful. I was there for a week with Visionaries, and it was a really rich, very diverse group of young people who were all committed to some form of social change in their communities. So I met some very inspiring people there that I'm still like best friends with today and still keep in contact with. And I'm seeing them build their practices and I'm continuing to build my practice. So it was a really, really enriching experience. And that had a lot to do with giving gratitude to land, and also kind of acknowledging access to land and how, you know, a lot of people are just disproportionately affected to a lack of access to land. So my name is Dalia, and I'm a freelance journalist and producer. And I am a producer at Refugee Week for the next 6 months, and also a producer at a magazine called ACV. And yeah, I'm a freelance journalist as well, so writing for places like The Guardian, Represent, It's Nice That, The New Arab, and I tend to write about marginalized creatives and marginalized creativity, and even more niche than that, I tend to focus on creatives from West Asia and North Africa, which is where I'm from. I'm Iraqi Egyptian, so it's really important for me to be highlighting creatives that I really relate to, and I want to highlight their work. I think that's me, that's my intro. Thank you.
Great. Well, over to me, I suppose. Hi everyone. Really, really nice to see familiar faces and people I don't know. My name's Miriam Rose, and my background really is in anti-mining activism. That's what I've done most of my life. And I think that gave me an amazing grounding in understanding what neocolonialism actually looks like by being on the ground in Africa and in India, dealing with British multinational mining companies and seeing how that all plays out with, facilitated by Department for International Development and the IMF. You know, I really saw what colonialism has merged into over 10 plus years. That's been my work. And then I came back 10 years ago with my brother to take over the management of my family's estate in South Oxfordshire, in Hardwick Estate. And I'm now the estate manager, but we're in the process of transitioning the estate into a different structure. And the organisation that I was mostly worked with as an activist is called Foil Vedanta, if anyone wants to look it up. And it targets a single British mining company, no longer a British mining company because we successfully chased them out of the UK, but they were a FTSE 100 company. And we did that as a case study, not because they're the worst mining company in the world, but because you have to have a target and a case study. And the idea was to link up grassroots groups. All the grassroots groups are affected by one mining company around the world, to link them into one movement. So yeah, that was wonderful. And you can have a look at our website if you're interested in that kind of work. I think that's me.
Thank you both. Already lots of snippets of what we're going to be just exploring there, so thank you. In the subtitle of this, the kind of write-up of this webinar, we wrote, what's the link between a 16th century Tudor house in Oxfordshire, the Australian Aborigines, a railroad in Canada, and urban teenagers growing up in London today? So I'm going to disappear off into the background now, but just handing over to you, Dalia, using that as a starting point, perhaps. Using that as a starting point to kick off the discussions.
Yeah, thank you, Max. I'm going to also just say again, I do have some screaming children outside. Well, they're not my own children, but there are screaming children outside this window right here. So if you do hear some concerning sounds, just try to ignore. But yeah, on that prompt, I think actually when you were inviting us to meditate on the land that we are sitting on, for me, that brought up a lot of, I'm currently in Morocco, which I'm not from Morocco, but Morocco was colonized by the French for decades, if not a century or centuries. and by the Spanish as well. And there are still pieces of land that are in Morocco and around Morocco that are still colonized by the Spanish and by the UK. So Gibraltar is really close to here. There's like a little part of Morocco, I can't remember the name, but it's like a Spanish kind of colony in a way, and you have to use your passport to like enter that piece of land, even though it's right in the middle of Morocco. I find the concept of borders itself, like Ceuta. Thank you so much. That's Ceuta, exactly. It's called Ceuta. And I find the concept of borders just generally mind-boggling and strange, but especially when you've got places within people's, like, you know, people's countries, people's nations that are still kind of like, this is a piece of land that is being controlled by people who have historically marginalized you and oppressed you is crazy to me that this is still continuing to this day. But I was also thinking about the palm trees, because palm trees are something that you see everywhere here in Morocco. And one of my friends was saying, you know, how palm trees are also, you find them in places like France. And I don't know the answer to this, whether palm trees are native to the south of France, but I have a feeling they're not. And they were brought over from places like Morocco and North Africa to kind of make the south of France, you know, look a lot more like tropical and whatever, and to kind of change the ecosystem there. I don't know, it just got me really thinking about the ways in which we can still find traces of colonialism in the land itself. It doesn't even necessarily have to be like through looking at, you know, history in the history books, or through art, or through laws that still exist. It's literally through like the ecosystem and the land itself. That was very powerful for me. But on that note, I'd like to hand over to Miriam and ask how she relates to her land, the land that she's on, the land that she inherited. And yeah, Miriam, I'd like to know more about how you feel with the kind of responsibility that you have when you took over this or you took on this piece of land.
Cool. Yeah, responsibility is definitely the word. I mean, I think the first thing to say is I've been so privileged to end up being part of the First Nations traditions, particularly Blackfoot Sweat Lodge, and one of the elders of that lodge is on the call. And that's really got me to understand the idea that we can't own land. So the one way I relate to it is by really feeling that, you know, I do not own it. My family does not basically own land. And it's very difficult because private ownership is so such an intrinsic part of our culture, particularly in the UK. I mean, it is, of course, part of capitalism, but particularly in the UK, the Englishman's home is his castle and everything. You know, one of the things that really disturbs me is when people come here and they say, we go for a walk, or, you know, somebody that's new to the estate or the countryside, and they say, "Thank you for all this," pointing at the wood, you know, and I feel sad. I keep, you know, I felt shouting, you know, I've got nothing to do with this. You know, this is nature. This is not, you know, it can't be owned, and I'm not, you know, I can't be thanked, and it's got nothing to do with me. So I think that that's very liberating. So I think there's a need for those of us who do own land to liberate ourselves from the idea of ownership and understand that it's basically nonsensical on one level. And I think the other, you know, for me, it's been a big journey. I mean, I grew up completely unaware of the privilege I had. I had a wonderful childhood, running around, running across the fields, running through the farmer's garden, picking all the strawberries whenever I wanted. And it was only when I was actually in my mid-20s, when I read a book by Alistair McIntosh called Soul and Soil, which is about the land reform movement in Scotland and communities who bought their land back from mismanaging aristocratic landowners, that I realised the privilege I had, and the fact that, you know, it became suddenly kind of the penny dropped, that not everyone who lived on the estate or the other tenants, they weren't walking through any field they wanted and picking the strawberries, but, you know, from the garden. I could do that because I had this special privilege of ownership. And suddenly I saw my whole childhood in a completely different way. You know, all the things that were magical suddenly became actually really problematic. And you know, and that's taken me a long time to metabolize. I'm probably still metabolizing it. But, you know, one of the points that I got to after a while was that it's not that I wish for no one to have the privilege I had. I wish for everyone to have the privilege I had, because in a way, one of the beautiful things that came from my childhood is I did feel responsibility for land. You know, I was brought up to feel responsibility for land because we owned it, you know, but you don't have to own it to feel responsibility for it. So I came to the place where I wish for everyone to be able to walk across the field and feel responsible and pick the strawberries. And that's kind of what we're trying to create here.
That's so powerful, because I think about, I grew up in Surrey, in kind of rural Surrey, and I had a lot of open space around me, and I am so grateful for that space, to have had access to that space. My parents had cars, they could drive me to big open spaces. We could walk to Polesden Lacey, which is in my village. It's a National Trust like house. I'm not sure of the history of like who owned it, but I do know that I did some digging last year, and I found out that it was a Tory MP who was part of not the East India Company, but a similar kind of merchant company, who obviously had ties to colonialism and to the transatlantic slave trade. And I found out that also Polesden Lacey, the owners of Polesden Lacey, also had slaves on the land, and one man called Zebedee Lovemore, who was enslaved on the land and then freed after the Tory MP's death. And so he had his own family that lived on Polesden Lacey. And I find that when I found that out, I was blown away, because I grew up in Surrey. It's like one of the whitest places in the UK, and I made my own peace when I was like a teenager with the fact that like I was consistently the only minority and the only person of color in natural spaces, and I was okay with that. And I thought, well, technically I'm on their land, I'm just here as a guest. And yes, I'm there as a guest in the sense that we are all guests in nature. We are all there, as you said, we have responsibility to nature. We should all feel that responsibility. But I'm not a guest in the UK. This is my home. I was born here, and I was raised here. And I was also raised in a rural area. So I do have a really deep connection to that specific piece of land, but also just to rural areas. And I do feel a deep responsibility to take care of them and to nurture them. But also on this point of, the myth that rural England has always been like a white haven, through my digging from Zebedee Lovemore, that got me like really interested in this topic, and finding out about like who was here before me as well, other than just these like rich white landowners and estate holders. Who was here before me? Who were the marginalized minorities here before me? And that led me to a beautiful series that I was talking about earlier with Max and Miriam by a presenter called Zakia Sewell. She's half English, half Caribbean. And she has produced a really amazing series called My Albion, where she explores whether she can claim ownership over the UK and Britain in the same way that white people do, essentially. And I mean, of course she can, of course we all do. But there was a really amazing piece of research that she did. She spoke to a professor, I can't remember his name now. Oh, I think it's Alex Niven. And he spoke about, I think it was Alex Niven, he spoke about how there was genetic research done in 2007 from the DNA of British white people, which had traces of West African genetic material. I don't know if anyone's heard of Cheddar Man, but Cheddar Man is like the first British person that we've like been able to find. And essentially he was dark skinned, and we know that he had West African genetic material in him. And the reason why we think of Britishness and light skinnedness as being kind of analogous is because of immigration, and because white people migrated to this country, to this piece of land, many moons ago. So for me, that was like such a comforting thing to learn. It was like, oh, I do have it's not just I'm a guest in the UK and like this is white people land and I'm just here as like their guest. No, this is all our land. Like land is land, as you said, Miriam. And since then, like I found this idea of people having ownership of pieces of land, like completely, yeah, it's very reductive, it's too simplistic, it doesn't make any sense. We all have responsibility, and in that sense also, like, building on that, what are the steps that we take then? You know, like, why would I want to take responsibility over this piece of land in the face of, like, the ecological crisis? For me, it's like encouraging other people of color to get out into nature and seeing why this is important to them too. Because that's something that I found, like, with my peers, they just didn't really see why they would care about these parks or yeah, like these big forests. And it was like, it's still something that it's grinding my gears daily, and something that I'm trying to yeah, trying to find more like-minded communities, I guess.
Well, I think this is one of the issues, isn't it? Especially in the UK, we've become so disconnected. We've become so urbanized and disconnected from land that there isn't even really a sort of memory. There must be a genetic memory, but there isn't a kind of obvious memory of that connection, or of why we need that connection. But certainly, if we're going to address all the multiple environmental crises, we need that connection badly. I mean, there was loads of research done, which I followed, what must be now 10 years ago, into behavior change. And with the kind of behaviour change that, you know, Greenpeace and you know, World Wildlife Fund was suggesting, which was kind of initiated, which was like, you know, reward initiated, like use energy saving light bulbs because they save you money. You know, will that form of change, or kind of guilt induced change, actually make the change we need to? And they actually did a lot of nature connection work with people to establish what actually deeply changes our environmental behaviour. And it all came down to feeling connected to nature. If you didn't actually feel that you had a relationship and a connection, and that you had a love for nature, you wouldn't ultimately, you know, have long-lasting change in your behaviour. So it is critical, and you know, and I think we need to be grounded in land. But you know, I think in the UK, you know, this is one of the things that I'm interested in. I'm very interested in other people's opinions about this too. One of the things I've come to think about, I've come to notice, is how dominated the UK is by estates. You know, and that's not the case in other parts of the world. Even in Ireland, they completely did away with their aristocracy, and most of Europe, they did away with the aristocracy. You know, England and Scotland is still completely and utterly bound up in aristocracy, and everywhere is an estate. You know, you walk from one estate to the next, and they carry a certain aesthetic. You know, they have the you know, wrought iron metal railings and the big gates and the big park trees and the old buildings. And I've come to see that whole aesthetic as really problematic, because it was all built on the back, you know, on the blood of Indigenous people, on the blood of, you know, in some cases, you know, enslaved people. And it's not a welcoming aesthetic, and it bears the memory of that. So, you know, I think that, I believe, although I'm not a person of colour, so I can't speak for people, but I assume that is one of the difficulties, is almost anywhere you go in England, you're reminded of that colonial aesthetic and the way land was divided up. And so, you know, this is one thing I'm interested in on Hardwick, is how we address that, you know. And I don't think it's about necessarily demolishing the buildings, but I do think it's about recognising, not denying, but recognising what the history was. And in my family's case, you know, my family bought the estate in the late 1800s with money that came from merchant banking. And my great-great-grandfather was one of the key people who built the Canadian Pacific Railway in Canada, which decimated Indigenous people in Canada, one of the worst things to happen to them, actually. And he had mines all over Australia and India. You know, ironically, I became an anti-mining activist, and I didn't even know at that time where the family's money had came from. So, you know, everything was built on the back of that. And I think we have to acknowledge that. We have to at least acknowledge that history, and not be hiding it, because we all know it's there. You know, I mean, to say a bit more about my family story, you know, growing up in this big, huge old house, manor house, we used to go into the attic as kids, or my grandma lived there at the time, and rifle through the piles of stuff, which was basically, I now realise, all hoarded from, you know, trips to the Empire in the Victorian era. There was a rug made out of 9 leopards sewn together. There was opium pipes, you know, there was stuff all amazing. We used to play with it and just throw it around. So, you know, we must have known on one level, the whole family must have known, you know, there's a bit of a history here, but nobody talked about it. Nobody mentioned it. You know, it was just kind of, so I think actually I subconsciously, there was a sense, let's not ask those questions, you know, let's not go there. And it was only when a local historian wrote a history of my great-great-grandfather, and it was a conservative history, that that it sort of came out really through that history that, you know, the merchant banking and where the money came from. And I was saying to him, you know, with my anti-mining activist background, he was saying things like, oh, you know, Sir Charles Rose was opening up pristine lands in Canada. And I was saying to him, you can't say that, you know, they weren't pristine, these were lands, territories that belonged to First Nations people. And he was saying, oh, well, there's no evidence of that, and it's not documented. I just sort of, I did the minimum to make sure there was nothing offensive in that biography, but I thought I'm not going to change his opinion. But then I went and did my own research and found that there was loads documented about it, you know, so much for not documented. There were loads of people's first-hand accounts of what happened in those places. So, you know, I brought it into the light, basically, and I started talking to my family about it and documenting it, and then eventually talking locally about it. And actually, while at first it felt very overwhelming, you know, I felt full of guilt, full of shame, very overwhelmed by the whole thing. Thought, my God, what am I going to do? I've got to go and do some huge apology. I've got to like kneel down in front of, you know, some First Nations people, and then realized that was much more about me somehow getting some sort of forgiveness or whatever. You know, then eventually got to the place where it just felt liberating, and actually it felt liberating for the rest of my family as well. You know, there's a sense of, oh, thank God, we kind of know, we know now, you know, and it wasn't us, you know, that it wasn't us that did it, but we are here holding the history, and we have the opportunity to shine a light on that history. And because I think by doing that, you kind of, it's like you release the ghosts almost, you kind of release the ghosts by bringing them into the light. And also you then enable people to see the connection between Britain's colonialism and its ongoing colonialism, which we have to understand. And if we're going to solve today's, you know, problems. So that was a long
No, I think it's, I find it, I think the thing with this guilt, the guilt that you're talking about, and the guilt that I have witnessed as well, you know, if I think about, again, Poston Lacey, but also just like so many manor houses and estates that I've seen in the UK that I've been to, that are kind of like marketed as British heritage and culture. So that's why you would want to see it, right? To feel connected to Britain, to feel like this is your, you know, this is British culture. It's souvenirs from the empire. It's memories of colonialism. And it's not obviously branded as that immediately, because we don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, but it is that in essence. And so you go into these houses and they're, as you said, filled with all these artifacts that are really deeply problematic and uncomfortable, and are, you know, like literal, figurative, like literal memoirs of horrific times and unspeakable times, and still ongoing, you know, colonialism. And this idea of guilt, when, you know, when people are confronted with that, when white British people are confronted with that history and that memory, of course it's something that people run away from and feel shame about and want to hide away from. And I think for me, when I started meeting more people who were really interested in like paganistic heritage and culture and tradition, or like if they were kind of Scottish British or Irish British or Welsh British, they would kind of go into their Scottishness, their Irishness, their Welshness, and by kind of going back to, and not completely going back, you don't need to like return to the original form, but kind of, you know, bringing up past histories or memories that we've maybe forgotten in favor of empire and of colonialism. I think that has helped people that I have met feel much more connected to Britain as a piece of land, as opposed to Britain as like an empire, or Britain as a nation. Because I've heard people firsthand say, you know, I don't want to claim Britain. Like white British people, my friends, have said to me, I don't want to claim Britain as my own. I don't like the British flag. I don't feel comfortable with like Britain's legacy of the empire. And of course they wouldn't. You know, why would you want to claim that as your own heritage? But I think in that sense, we should encourage people then not to, and to actively like remove yourself from that like guilt and that shame, and to move forward into how can I then find a way that makes me feel connected to Britain in a way that feels not only, you know, safe for other people's existence, but also that makes me feel proud to be British, proud to be Welsh, Irish, Scottish, whatever. And I think a lot of people I know, as well as Zakia Sewell, actually the woman who did the My Albion series, she's like a new pagan, she calls herself. And there was a piece in The Guardian about like paganism, and it was called Cool as Folk, like cool as FOLK, and like kind of this like pagan revivalism, folklore revivalism, you know, not trying to force it down people's throats or anything, each to their own, but I do think there's an element in that of a more authentic and humanistic connection to land, and you know, empire connection to land, if that makes sense.
And I think this is where going beyond borders is so important, because the reality is that we in the UK lost our links to our Indigenous heritage. You know, we don't have Indigenous people, at least we don't in England anymore, to ask what were the myths, what were the origin myth, you know, stories, what were the rituals, those things that actually do help tie us to the land. So actually, if we're going to, you know, I can tell a story that comes from the sweat lodge that I'm part of, which is that this particular group, the Blackfoot on the Blood Reservation, lost their Sundance. The tradition had gone, they'd forgotten how to do it. So they went to another nation to ask what the Sundance tradition was and to get it back, you know. And so we can go now, or we can listen to other Indigenous cultures to find out, because basically these earth-based traditions are all relatively similar. They're all honouring nature and our connection, you know. So we actually need now to listen and reach out to other cultures to reconnect with our own indigeneity, and I find that really exciting. You know, that's like the reverse of colonialism. You know, it's not about going and plundering, it's about actually listening and respecting and learning from, you know, some cultures that maybe our ancestors were trying to destroy, but now we need those back because we need to reconnect. And also what you were talking about reminded me, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a talk here at Hardwick about Hardwick's ancient history, which I'm not a historian at all. And I have no, you know, when I look at the landscape, I just see what I spoke about. I see estates, you know, and I get very annoyed by it. But, you know, the woman who was talking, when she looks at the landscape, she sees Iron Age forts and the lynchets, you know, the old fields. And I started seeing them now. You know, I was in Yorkshire last week on a big estate, but I started seeing all these lynchets, you know, and that, so now I'm starting to feel connected to Iron Age humans who, interestingly, she was saying in the talk that, you know, we have all these famous Iron Age hill forts. So the assumption is that they were aggressive, you know, they were warring. But actually, the hill forts were named by the Romans because they were warring. They came to take over the UK. But actually, all the evidence shows that the Iron Age people they didn't have a lot of battles. They were actually, they seemed to get on quite well with each other, you know. So yeah, that's just reconnected me to another idea of what our past was, and that we weren't necessarily fighting, you know, all this kind of concept of savages, you know, it's interesting to hear this woman say there's no evidence of that whatsoever, but so often what we hear about our ancient past is, oh, we were savages, we were fighting each other, and, you know, there's so much more to it than that, that we can reconnect with.
Yeah, completely. And what you said about myth as well, I love. I've been thinking about myth a lot, and also like with my own. Sorry, there's a really loud bird. I've been muting myself, but it's very loud here apparently today.
Can't hear it.
Oh, great, because it's really squawking. Yeah, in terms of myth, I've been thinking about ways that the myths of Britain, as you know, like the land shaping myths, some beautiful myths about how Britain was shaped by like demigods and giants. And I love, you know, I love story and I love myth. And I've always been interested in those stories, but you know, I got to a point in I studied English literature and I read a lot all the time, and I got to a point where I realized that I was only reading like English, British literature, and I wasn't expanding from that. So when I started reading more about the myths from my like motherland, which is Iraq and Egypt as well, I found so many similarities between like land shaping myths from both Britain and Iraq, and also some huge dissimilarities as well. And comparing and contrasting those was like so exciting for me and gave me such a new like way to connect with Britain, because for so long I was really rejecting Britain as like mine, like I kind of spoke about before. And I think a lot of young people of color, especially today, are really also like kind of feel like they want to do that and are doing that. They're rejecting Britain. They're like, no, this is not my home. Like, I don't feel welcome here. Why would I feel welcome in a place that has, you know, historically marginalized my people, have gone to my motherland and like kicked out a bunch, you know, my parents, my grandparents? Why would I feel connected to a country that waves its flag and its national anthem is about, you know, ruling the waves and essentially like, you know, yeah, plundering and pillaging other lands? Of course, we wouldn't feel connected to that. And that kind of returns back to the idea of why estates are such, not invasive, but such confrontational kind of memoirs for so many marginalized people in this country. And why, yeah, I feel like I'm really, what I love about your work is that I've been so desperate to find people that will acknowledge that and not run away from that guilt and that shame. Because once the acknowledgement starts, we can start rebuilding these beautiful myths. We can start reintroducing those beautiful myths into these pieces of land and these areas, which is so desperately needing some of that myth to return. Like I love the land that Colston Lacey Estate sits on. It's a beautiful piece of land and I feel really connected to it. But when I look at the house itself, when I go into the house, I've actually stopped going in the house, because after I learned about Zebedee Lovemore and the slaves that this that the Tory MP had, it made me feel so deeply, like on a spiritual level, so uncomfortable. So I've stopped going into the house. And what you were talking about, like colonial aesthetics as well. I mean, you see it in estates, and you also see it when you're just walking around London as well. And I think it's a big reason as to why so many people, yeah, again, feel like they don't want to claim the UK as their own. And that makes me sad. Like, I do want to be proud to be British. And I'm not like the most proud. I could be prouder, but at the moment, I'm not super proud to be British. But there are parts of British culture and myth and literature that I love so much that I want to keep that connection. And I've been able to do that through accessing land and being on land, and being like in rural parts of England. But also on that note, I'm kind of interested to hear from you a little bit about class as well, because I'm aware that we're both, I'm a middle class person, and you're a quote unquote landowner. And for me, the idea of like land access has always been a racial issue, let's say, and it was never a class issue. It was never a physical access issue. I could always access it physically. I moved to London a few years ago, and London, we're very lucky, is a very, very green city, but still working class people are definitely marginalized from those spaces. I'm wondering if there's anything in there that you could speak to in terms of Hardwick, or is there like something that, is there work that you're wanting to do or maybe have already done when it comes to class?
Well, I think, you know, I have a slight tendency, probably because of my activist background, to want to tackle everything at Hardwick. And I also think that's kind of makes sense because you know, Hardwick's almost 1,000 acres. It's got 100 people living on it, you know, as tenants, or some owning their own houses, mostly as tenants, about 30 cottages, barges, etc. So, you know, we are a little microcosm of society in the countryside, near us, sitting near Reading. And, you know, so we kind of, and so I think you have an opportunity to tackle so many different issues, you know, how you look after your old people, how you grow food, how you, whatever. But one of those issues, especially because we're so close to Reading, is how do we not become a bubble, not become just a lovely little middle class bubble in the southeast, which is doing everything really nicely, but really it's for us, and we don't really want the people that leave rubbish or whatever coming into it. And that was a huge issue during COVID, because suddenly, people did start accessing the countryside because they had nowhere else to go. And the attitudes of people were quite shocking. Somebody said on our Hardwick Estate WhatsApp group, close the gates. The big metal gates, they've never been closed in my lifetime. Close the gates. So that's can be the feeling of preciousness. And, and part of that attitude comes from the love of the place and a sense of the sensitivity of nature. And part of it comes from a fear of outsiders, So, access to land has now become a really important issue, and that the estate is going to be transitioning into a community-led charity. Me and my brother came back here because we didn't believe in aristocratic ownership, and we want to create a new model for the way the estate's owned and step back. But as part of that charity, access to land is going to be a key issue. And the first thing that, actually, it was our farm advisor of all people who said, we were talking about land management and, what should we grow where? And he said, well, before you tackle that issue, I suggest you think about what the community needs from land. And by that, I mean marginalised communities in your area, which I thought was an amazingly profound thing to say. His name's Mark Measures, to big him up. He's a organic farm advisor in the UK. He's retired now. And so that started a Kickstarter project of basically trying to reach out to all different kinds of, marginalised groups from Reading. And we made a list of all the different types of groups there are. Lots of them, Reading is very diverse. So lots of them are, people of colour. And then there's all the white working class people who have no access to the countryside either. So we're trying to create relationships with different groups and do an experimental piece of work to see what works for them. Because what we don't want to do, what I particularly don't want to do, is go into a paternalistic kind of thing that's been done so many times before, of saying, oh, we welcome people, poor people here, and we'll do something good for you, and then we'll feel good about ourselves. I really don't want it to be that. I want it to be about building relationships between the urban, people and the countryside, lasting relationships where we realize this is actually an exchange. We learn from you, you learn from us. It's, it's two-way. So that's what this project that we started is meant to be about, building those relationships and then having those discussions, and tentatively them coming here or us going to Reading and, working out what works and in an action research sense, looking at, well, what are the barriers, or maybe this isn't a place people want to come, so being really open to whatever comes out of it. But I think it is so important to raise the class issue as well as the colour issue, because white working class people often feel left behind, and not that their issues aren't addressed. And I think that is really important. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, it is quite shocking. You mentioned, enjoying the conversation because you haven't found many white people that want to talk about this. And I was really shocked to discover really how few white people, landowners or people from families involved in the slave trade have actually come out to talk about it. It's like a handful, really. And I think they've been really attacked by the right-wing media also. But I just feel like it's critical that we start, those of us who are willing to talk, do so as widely as possible and try to inspire others to just get the conversation going among white British people. And yes, as you mentioned, the first thing that comes up is guilt, and that can be quite hard to overcome. So I think we need to be, needs to be holding a lot of sensitivity around how you process that guilt. But you do move through the guilt, and then you get to the point, as you've talked about, of rebuilding your relationship, in a much cleaner way. So I think it's profoundly needed, and I am really committed to talking about, talking in my, feeling my way, but talking as publicly as I can, because I just think this conversation needs to be had. And it's very clear that it shouldn't be, from things I've read and from people I've spoken to, it shouldn't be up to people of colour to educate white people in the UK about what colonialism was or what the slave trade was. It's really not their job. It's really, we need to really take this one on ourselves. So I'm trying to take that advice really on board.
Yeah, for sure. In the same way that it doesn't fall on women to teach men about misogyny. It's about men in their own circles talking about misogyny between themselves and discussing how, and holding each other accountable. It's the same thing with class and with access to land and land ownership. It's about people with that privilege and with that quote unquote power to acknowledge that they have that in the first place, and to say to other people who, you know, their peers, people who they're close to, people who they're adjacent to, people in their communities and their bubbles and their circles, to bring it up. Like with it takes a lot of bravery though. It's very scary. And again, because I'm middle class, I've had a lot of conversations with like my middle class family, and I've had conversations with people in my middle class bubbles that I grew up in Surrey, about things like class and race, that have felt so terrifying. And sometimes, a lot of the time, you do not get the reaction that you're hoping to get. But I think in the face of that, to continue is really powerful. And two people that I want to highlight on that point, one is Corinne Fowler, who I think me and Miriam spoke about before. Maybe some of you know Corinne Fowler, but she worked at the National Trust, or maybe still works at the National Trust, I'm actually not sure, but she wrote an incredible book about called Green Unpleasant Land, about decolonizing the outdoors essentially in the UK. And also she did a groundbreaking report about the National Trust's links to and ties to colonialism and the slave trade. But it's like when the report came out, everyone was really surprised, but really, and I was really surprised, but really, it's not surprising at all, really, that this, you know, these estates and these country homes had such strong ties to colonialism. But also Alex Niven, who I briefly mentioned earlier, who's a writer, an English writer, poet, editor, and former musician, who said this amazing quote that I'm just going to quote for you, which kind of touches on the themes of like myth that we were talking about earlier, and English culture specifically. England sacrificed its identity and sold its soul to this sense of Britishness and this wider sense of empire. Once you get too powerful, you lose this sense of soulfulness, that sense of identity that you get in opposition to power. And that got me thinking about like all of our most well-preserved and still observed British traditions are mostly colonial, rooted in colonial things, like just kind of like mundane, or not mundane things, but trivial things, from like street parties to like quite significant things like royal weddings, and how we still are like taking a bank holiday to celebrate the king's coronation, the fact that we have a royal family in the first place. These are all memories of colonialism, and not just memories, they're artifacts of like, and reminders that we are still living in a time of empire. Even the national anthem, it's like really bothers me. And like, I was told to get up every day at school to like sing the national anthem, and it's like actively quite harmful language. So I think the fact that people like that are really openly and bravely, and people like yourself, Miriam, who are starting these conversations within their own circles and people that they can reach, it's kind of like, I think, Max, you use this analogy with me of watering your own little garden. It was, what was it? Think local? No, think global, act local. That's the one. I always mix the two up. But it's like watering your own little patch of grass and tending to your own little garden, to allow it to flourish and grow. And in that way, you'll create like this butterfly effect of like many beautiful little gardens, as opposed to trying to change the whole forest because you want it to, like, it needs to be changed, and trying to go around and fix everything and getting so overwhelmed that you don't try at all. And I think as people of color especially, we often have that feeling of, oh God, we need to like fix all the world's problems in terms of like racism, colonialism, oppression, because it all lands on us, and you know, we are the ones who are oppressed, so we need to fight the people who are oppressing us. But actually, when it comes from people who are in those positions of power and privilege, going kind of sideways, rather than people who are told that they're here, trying to speak to people who are there, it's so much more powerful, because unfortunately, you know, the relatability really helps. And yeah, I think we are at a time when we might open it up to Q&A from our wonderful guests, unless there was something, Miriam, that you wanted to add before we hand it over to questions.
Well, I might just add two more book recommendations since you started that. One is amazing book called Blood Legacy by Alex Renton, which is the most unbelievable documentation of his family's transatlantic slave trade links. He's a Scottish writer, and it's the story of slavery told from the perspective of the slave owner, because he has this huge family archive, and he's been very brave in bringing all this into the foreground. It's so well written. That was quite recent. And the other person I just wanted to mention, it just came to mind when you were speaking, who I find a role model, is a guy called Anthony Gifford, who's he's a British lawyer, became a barrister, who's one of the main people who's fought the case for reparations in all sorts of different countries. He lives in Jamaica now, and he's been involved in every kind of interesting human rights legal case you can imagine. But he's from a white upper class background, and he's so dedicated to the issue of reparations and working for people. I just think he's an amazing role model. Anyway, that's all I'd like to say. I'd love to hear from others now.
Yeah,